Every few months, a number gets reported on the news, and politicians either celebrate it or panic about it. GDP went up. GDP went down. The economy grew by 2.3%. The economy shrank for the second consecutive quarter. Reporters say these words with extreme seriousness. Economists argue about what the numbers mean, and most regular people nod along while having absolutely no idea what's actually being measured. GDP is supposed to be the single most important number for understanding how an economy is doing. It drives elections, shapes government policy, moves stock markets, and influences decisions that affect billions of people. And yet, if you stopped 100 people on the street and asked them to explain what GDP actually measures, maybe 3 could give you a clear answer. The other 97 would say something vague about money and the economy and hope you change the subject. I think the problem is that GDP is one of those concepts that sounds like it should be complicated, so people assume it is and stop trying. It isn't complicated, it's just poorly explained. If you're the person who never gets it until someone gives you the right analogy, this channel is for you. Subscribe. Let me start with what GDP literally stands for and what it's measuring, because once you see the core idea, everything else is just details. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross means total, domestic means within one country. Product means stuff that was produced. So GDP is the total value of everything produced within a country over a specific period of time, usually a year or a quarter. Everything. Every haircut given, every car manufactured, every coffee sold, every surgery performed, every house built, every app subscription purchased, every legal consultation billed. If someone produced a good or performed a service and money changed hands for it within the country's borders during that period, it counts toward GDP. Think of GDP like the total receipt for an entire country's output over a year. Imagine every single transaction that happened, every product sold, every service rendered, every meal served, every rent payment processed, and you added them all up on one impossibly long receipt. The number at the bottom is GDP. For the United States, that number is somewhere around $28 trillion. For Canada, roughly $2.2 trillion. For a small country like Iceland, around $30 billion. That's the core concept. Everything after this is just understanding what the number tells you, what it doesn't, and why people argue about it. Let me go deeper on how GDP is actually calculated, because there's a beautifully simple logic to it once you see the framework. There are 3 ways to calculate GDP, and they all arrive at the same number, which is a good sanity check. But the one most people find intuitive is the spending approach, because it breaks the economy into 4 buckets. Think of the entire economy like a restaurant's revenue report broken into 4 types of customers. The first and biggest customer is consumers. In most developed economies, consumer spending makes up roughly 55 to 70% of GDP. Regular people buying stuff. Groceries, clothes, rent, Netflix, gas, restaurant meals, phone bills. This is the table that orders the most every night and keeps the restaurant alive. The second customer is businesses. Companies buying equipment, building factories, stocking inventory, investing in software. This is the table that doesn't come in every night, but when they do, they order big. Business investment is chunkier and more volatile than consumer spending. In a good year, businesses are expanding and spending heavily. In a bad year, they pull back hard. The third customer is the government. Federal, provincial, or state, and local. Every road paved, every teacher paid, every military jet purchased, every public hospital operating. Government spending is the most predictable table in the restaurant because governments tend to spend consistently regardless of the economy. In fact, they often spend more during downturns to compensate for the other tables ordering less. The fourth customer is the rest of the world. This one is a bit different because it works in both directions. When another country buys something your country produced, that's an export, money flowing in. When your country buys something produced elsewhere, that's an import, money flowing out. The GDP calculation takes exports minus imports, So if you export more than you import, you're adding to GDP. And if you import more than you export, you're subtracting. Think of exports and imports like a restaurant, where customers sometimes bring their own food. If more outside food comes in than meals go out to other restaurants, the kitchen's contribution looks smaller. If the kitchen is shipping meals to other restaurants more than outside food is coming in, the kitchen's contribution looks bigger. Net exports is just the balance between what you're selling to the world and what you're buying from it. Add all four together. Consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. That's GDP. Quick favor before the next part, because this next section covers what GDP growth actually means and why politicians obsess over tiny percentage changes. If this has been useful, hit the like button. It makes a genuine difference for a channel this size. Back to it. When the news says GDP grew by 2.1%, they're saying the total receipt got 2.1% bigger compared to the previous period. The country produced 2.1% more stuff. More haircuts, more cars, more surgeries, more software, more everything. That sounds small. 2%. Who cares? Think of GDP growth like the speed of an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier is enormous, heavy, and takes forever to change direction or speed. A 2% increase in speed on an aircraft carrier is a massive amount of additional momentum. You barely notice it from the deck, but the engine room is working significantly harder, and the ship is covering meaningfully more distance. A large economy works the same way. 2% growth on a $28 trillion economy means $560 billion of additional output. That's new jobs, new businesses, more tax revenue, higher incomes, more goods and services flowing through the system. It doesn't feel dramatic year to year, but compounded over a decade, it transforms a country. This is also why negative GDP growth is such a big deal. When GDP shrinks, even by 0.5%, it means less is being produced. Less production means fewer jobs needed. Fewer jobs means less consumer spending. Less consumer spending means less revenue for businesses. Less revenue means more layoffs. More layoffs mean even less spending. It's a spiral, and once it starts, it's hard to reverse. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is the common shorthand for a recession, though economists will argue about the technical definition until the end of time. But the basic idea is that when the receipt starts getting smaller instead of bigger, things go wrong quickly because the entire system was built to assume the receipt would keep growing. Now let me talk about what GDP doesn't tell you, because this is where the number gets dangerously misleading. GDP measures how much was produced. It does not measure who got the benefit. Think of GDP like measuring the total food produced on a cruise ship. The kitchen reports that 10,000 meals were served today, up from 9,500 yesterday. Sounds great. But if 5,000 of those meals went to 100 guests in the VIP suites, and the other 5,000 were split among 3,000 passengers in economy, the total number is meaningless for understanding whether most people on the ship ate well. This is exactly what happens with GDP in real economies. GDP can grow year after year while the median person's income stays flat because the growth is concentrated at the top. The receipt got bigger, but most of the new items on it were purchased by a small number of people. The country is technically richer. Most people in it don't feel richer. And GDP, by design, cannot tell you the difference. GDP also counts things that aren't necessarily good. A massive car accident boosts GDP because it generates ambulance rides, hospital bills, car repairs, insurance claims, and legal fees. A hurricane boosts GDP because of the rebuilding effort. A country that spends a fortune on healthcare because its population is unhealthy has a higher GDP than an identical country whose people are healthy and don't need as much treatment. The receipt gets bigger, the people aren't better off. This is why economists have spent decades arguing about whether GDP is actually a good measure of prosperity or just a measure of activity. Activity and prosperity are not the same thing. A hamster on a wheel is very active. The hamster isn't going anywhere. GDP also misses a huge amount of real economic value. If you hire a nanny through an agency, it counts toward GDP. If a grandparent watches the same child for free, it doesn't. If you pay a contractor to renovate your kitchen, GDP goes up. If you renovate it yourself over a weekend, nothing gets counted. All the unpaid work in a society, caregiving, volunteering, household labor, subsistence farming, is invisible to GDP, even though it's obviously valuable. Think of GDP like a fitness tracker that only counts steps taken outside. Your indoor workout, your stretching, your yoga session, none of it registers. The tracker says you were inactive. You know you weren't. But anyone looking only at the tracker's number would draw the wrong conclusion. Let me talk about GDP per capita quickly, because this is the version of the number that actually tells you something useful about living standards. GDP per capita divides the total GDP by the population. It's the average output per person. It doesn't tell you what each person actually received, but it gives you a ballpark of how productive the economy is, relative to how many people it supports. Think of it like splitting a restaurant bill evenly. The total bill was $500 for a table of 10. GDP per capita says each person's share is $50. In reality, one person ordered the lobster and 3 people had salads. But as a rough comparison between tables, knowing the per-person average is useful. A table of 10 with a $500 bill is probably eating better than a table of 10 with a $150 bill, even if the distribution within each table isn't equal. This is why GDP per capita is more useful than raw GDP for comparing countries. China's total GDP is massive, second largest in the world. But divided by 1.4 billion people, the per capita number is much lower than smaller economies like Switzerland, Norway, or Canada that have less total output but far fewer people sharing it. Let me stack all of this together so it locks in. GDP is the total receipt for everything a country produced in a year. It's calculated by adding 4 customers at the restaurant: consumers, businesses, government, and net exports. GDP growth is like speed changes on an aircraft carrier. Small percentages represent enormous momentum. Negative growth triggers a spiral because the whole system assumes the receipt keeps getting bigger. But GDP doesn't tell you who's eating well on the cruise ship. It counts car accidents and hurricanes as positives, and it completely ignores the grandmother watching the kids for free like a fitness tracker that only counts outdoor steps. GDP per capita is the bill split evenly, and is the better number for comparing living standards between countries. That's GDP. A useful but deeply imperfect number that tells you how much activity is happening in an economy, not whether that activity is making people's lives better. Knowing the difference between those two things is the first step toward understanding economics as it actually exists, rather than how it gets reported on the evening news. If this helped GDP finally make sense, do me 2 quick favors. Hit the like button and subscribe so you catch the next one. I'm deciding between 2 topics for the next video, and I want you to pick. Should I explain how inflation works using a shrinking ruler analogy, or how interest rates work using a thermostat analogy? Drop A or B in the comments, and whichever gets more votes, I'll make first. Thanks for watching.